Welcome to another Ideas That Matter conversation. I have here somebody who years ago was gracious enough to send me one of his several books, Chris Bateman, and the book is The Virtuous Cyborg. I want to give a very short introduction, and then we're going to leap right into talking about what cyborg nature would have to do with traditional conceptions of virtue. So right now, Chris is the managing director and chief consultant for International Hobo Limited, which, over here in the States, hobo has a kind of pejorative sound to it, but it signifies, ranging around and all of that sort of stuff. He's kind of a, Oh, go ahead.
I would like to say that when I chose that name, many people told me not to take that line.
Really?
Hobos were dirty and smelly, and it wasn't a good branding. But it was such an accurate description of my living circumstances, because for the first year of the company, it was me and a laptop. And my wife is American, and we were dating at the time. So I was traveling to the US and then back to Europe, coming in on a 90-day visa, literally no fixed abode. So, International Hobo is not just the name of the company. It is pretty much
an accurate description. Yes. Yeah. And it's better than, say, the old digital nomad, which everybody's used. So it's got some distinctiveness to it. The only other thing I'll say is, so Chris has, you could say, sometimes we say somebody has one foot in one world and one foot in another, but I gather that you've got a lot of feet, and among them are the academic world. You've been a games researcher and senior lecturer at University of Bolton. You've been a visiting professor at Laguna College of Art and Design, but you've also got a massive amount of experience in game design and, interestingly, also working with some, let's call them literary celebrities, Terry Pratchett, for example, right? And you also write books. And the books that you write are challenging, I suppose, for some people, but they're well written enough that anybody can get what they need out of them, and they take up very interesting topics. So what else?
Greg?
Oh, you're very welcome. What else would you like people to know about you before we start talking about some of the topics of cybervirtue?
Oh, gosh. That's a terrible opening question, Greg. That's just really mean-spirited. I suppose before I took up academic positions, I used to say I'm not an academic, but I smell like one. But now, having, as you put it, had one leg in academia and had it bitten off, I now view myself as a refugee from the academic space. I got a lot of love and a lot of respect for the people who can make it work in academia, which I think is very challenging, and I think is especially challenging at the moment. I'm a bit of a skeptic that the things that we currently call universities deserve the name, to be quite honest. And I bizarrely have found myself much more comfortable returning to industry. It seems strange to me to work for something calling itself a university where my job was basically to pretend to be assisting industry when I could just be out in industry. I don't really think that we should be creating universities whose sole purpose is to service industry. This, to me, is not a university, and I'm pretty horrified by it. Don't want to knock specific institutions. I think this is a problem with universities as a whole, basically. I think we've lost track of what the university is for, frankly.
Yeah, I've actually said this in a number of places, and I took a photograph recently that I'm going to be posting. So I teach locally here at Marquette University, which is officially a Jesuit university, and is supposed to have some sort of Catholic ethos. And if you know anything about the Jesuits, they were all about the humanities. They didn't dislike the sciences, but they thought that studying philosophy, theology, literature was really central. Actually, drama too. That's part of the Jesuit idea. And you would have to really dig deep to find much of a trace of any of that ethos left in the place. And one of the really telling signs is if you walk around campus and you look at what buildings are very beautiful and well put together and updated, it's all the professions. So you have engineering, you have law, even nursing has a beautiful new building, business, of course, dentistry, wonderful new building. And it's not just the humanities that are in kind of poor shape. If you go into the humanities buildings, they're very run down. Things haven't been replaced. In the building that would be like the humanities building par excellence, there's an image of Loyola, and it's underneath a staircase. So you have to kind of look to find it there. It's almost like they've hidden it away. But when you go to the science buildings, which are all named after the same person, there's Aware Physics, Aware Chemistry, Aware Life Sciences. They're as run down as the humanities buildings because, it's the professions that essentially run the place now. And they recently shrunk the course. So now you only take one philosophy class instead of the two that you normally took, instead of the three that you took before. Same with theology, history, even only one writing class, strangely enough.
Well,
So,
we're watching specialization eat away at the concept of a university.
yeah.
Actually, so I write a couple of substacks, but my philosophy substack, Stranger Worlds, my theme for next month, for October, is thinking about thinking and the way that specialization in universities has undermined thought and our shared practices for thought. I do think.
I think that's quite right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think lots of people share this intuition that this delight in specialization, whilst it's certainly been good for raising grant money for universities, hasn't been great for the university if you have a concept of what a university, I daren't say should be, because then I open a whole can of worms, but what a university has been and could be.
That's right. And I think that it's something that's at risk of being lost as new generations come through. I notice that my students, they have no expectation of what they're getting into ought to look like, other than a few vague things from television shows, which really don't have to do with the kind of places I teach.
Has The Good Place been a net benefit for you as a philosophy academic, or has it actually made your job harder?
That's actually a great question. So I'll say this at first. So I'm not really that qualified to talk about the show itself, because I was excited when I heard about it. I watched the first few episodes, decided it was garbage, and I was primed to love it because I love Ted Danson. The other stars were people who I enjoy watching. And I was like, this is just such cookie cutter nonsense. It's what a person who took a few philosophy courses taught by somebody who just stuck to the textbook would think that philosophy is, trolley problems and stuff like that, writing things on the board. And I'm not knocking writing things on the board, which I do myself. Right? But in doing so in a very formulaic kind of way. Now, I'm told that it got better over time, and I don't know if that's the case because I haven't given it a chance because I don't have the time. So I do get people, and it's not so much in academia. I don't think that many academics really took The Good Place seriously, and I don't think that many students in the present remember it. Their memory horizon is very short, but I do get a lot of ordinary people who've watched the show who seem to think that's what philosophy is. And
I loved your take down there. That was a positive character assassination of the show. But I think at a time when it can be a genuine challenge for people to even understand what philosophy is, it might not be a bad thing to have a popular show which actually, even giving false impressions, get some exposure to philosophy. Well, when I was in Manchester, I used to appear sometimes on the local Manchester radio would get me in as a local minor celebrity, an H-list celebrity, I like to say. It's about as far from the A-list as you could possibly imagine. And I'm always having to sort of introduce me in a way that pussy puts around the fact that nobody listening really has any clue what a philosopher is. So that was always a lot of fun, watching them try and come up with inventive ways of describing what it was, or to avoid describing what it was by saying things like, I wonder if any of you know what a philosopher is. And that's my introduction. That's great.
I will say this, now that you say that, I'm happy that people are making references to something that's a little bit more contemporary as if it's something new, because otherwise before that, the one single what would you call it? Like touch point
Mhm.
would be Monty Python sketches. So you have the argument clinic and you have the philosophers playing football with each other. And then I think a
Absolutely.
few things about Jean-Paul Sartre. And you look at that and you're like, well, okay, that's the way people thought of philosophy back in the 1970s at Oxford and Cambridge and places like that. It sure as hell wasn't anything like what we're considering philosophy in other places in the world. But because of the cultural dominance, a lot of people bring it up as if like they're introducing me, who's been in the field since I was essentially a kid. They're introducing something new to me. Hey, have you seen this Monty Python sketch? I'll be like, yeah, when I was an undergraduate, we thought that was really cool back then. But that's because we were only, I don't know, 15 years away from it in time. So I
Yeah.
suppose it's good to have other representations out there, and they can be like a gateway drug.
You're full of great analogies. I love it. Excellent. Yes. No, I'm genuinely curious about what the effect was there, and I think you're right. There aren't that
Mm.
many cultural touchstones that keep philosophy in people's attention, and yeah, anything that actually makes it seem less bizarre to practice philosophy is probably a good thing. I got to hope.
Yeah, I suppose there was that movie that Kevin Spacey, the now disgraced Kevin Spacey, did where he was a philosophy professor, and I don't remember it very well, but it was, sort of typical thing, writing things on the board, asking questions about this, perhaps sleeping with his students, if I remember right. But we want to, you know, shove that stuff in the back so nobody thinks that's what a philosophy professor actually is. I suppose for a lot of people, philosophy professor as a type is probably interchangeable with other people in the humanities, like English professor or history professor.
Well, look, in a culture where the humanities are largely seen as a foo-foo extra that we're keeping at the university just for old time's sake, you can throw all the humanities into one big bucket and ignore all of the different points of views that they have. It does seem harsh to the historians, though, who have an equal claim to being a science as to be a humanities subject.
That's right. And have been around historically as long as
Yeah.
philosophy, right? So
Absolutely. Yeah. And they've had the same name for the entirety of their existence, which literally no science can claim. So I feel like they ought to get some street cred for that, if nothing else.
that's true.
Yeah.
Even like medicine, which has been around a long time, um, that's a more recent term.
Yeah.
So
Certainly
yeah.
in the way we use it now.
And it took a while for philosophy to settle on that term. I guess you could say maybe around the time of Socrates. Perhaps there were people calling themselves
We
philosophers
spew it
before
though
that.
because we're going to look at by even choosing the name philosophy, we're going to look mostly at European
That's right.
philosophy because of course there's older philosophies in what's now China, but the
Yep.
philosophy isn't and wasn't used and is only retrospectively applied to it. So yeah.
Yeah, as well as India, you could say
India as
too.
well. Well,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah.
it. That there's huge, for want of a better description, backlogs of philosophy on that side of the world that most of the people raised on European philosophy never touch, never even come close to getting into, and certainly these days don't get into in the original language in the way that the philologists and philosophers past would have felt obligated to do.
Quite
It
true.
is the
Yeah.
thing that I find most disappointing about my philosophy is that although I have I can get by in other languages, you can drop me anywhere and I'll be able to order a beer in a pub within 24 hours. But I don't have the skill with the written languages to be able to work with original text, which I feel is an enormous
Yes. You
disappointment.
know, one of the common questions that I get, because I do, like public AMAs, is why aren't you doing Eastern philosophy? And I'll say, well, to begin with, there's no such thing as Eastern philosophy. The Indian cultural sphere is its own interesting thing. And of course, it has connections to the Chinese cultural sphere, through, say, Buddhism. But I mean, they're as different from each other as they are from what took place in Western Europe. And they're just as vast. And then, so that's one part. And then I say, Exactly what you just articulated. I can't read the source texts in the way that I can. I'm lucky in that I can read French, German, classical Latin, and classical Greek, and I can kind of puzzle through academic articles in Italian or Portuguese or stuff like that.
Would you
But
consider yourself a continental philosopher with this engagement?
no, I call myself a historian. That's kind of these days that means you're doing either history in a sort of antiquarian way, or you're doing philosophy as a way of life. You're saying
Sure.
we're studying Aristotle because he actually has something relevant to say to us in the
I would
present.
hope, teaching at a Jesuit faculty, that Aristotle was an important part of your curriculum, frankly.
Oh yeah, actually we're doing parts of the Nickel McCain ethics this week. But so it's always, a matter of making it relevant to the current crop of students, because otherwise none of it's going to stick in their head beyond the semester. You got to show them that this stuff actually has some application. But coming back to it, so I mean, I don't read classical Chinese. I don't read Sanskrit or Pali or anything like that. So I'm going to be much more leery about saying I actually understand what's going on, in the Analects or the Tao Te Ching or anything like that. And the third thing is, I think that, we should recognize there's a division of labor. There's people out there who do really great work in, explaining Chinese philosophy. Brian Van Norden is a great example of somebody who's devoted his lifetime to it. And so, he's got videos. Why should I be trying to cover the same ground that somebody better than me is? It seems kind of silly, a poor waste of time,
Well, it's interesting because we were mocking the specialization in the university earlier, and now you're providing a defense for specialization within a field, and as you put it, division of labor.
Very
I've got some
broad
respect for that.
specializations.
I do, and I think if my written languages were stronger, and I felt that I could engage with more text directly, I'd feel more obligated to stick to one place.
Yeah.
But precisely because I'm reliant on other people's translations, what I end up doing instead is covering a much wider range of sources when I'm working in philosophy, but also trying to not rely on single translations. And I'm willing, although it slows me down, when I get to a really good passage, to go and look at the source and then patiently. There's a whole bunch of dictionaries on the shelf. I would quite happily go through it word by word and put together my candid translation of a section of it, because it's non-trivial. There's an Italian saying which I've always loved, which is all translation is betrayal.
Yeah.
Which I think is a beautiful sentiment. But I think also that even within one language, all speech is betrayal. I mean, you're already dealing with ambiguities the moment that you're working in the medium of language.
Yeah. That's quite true. And I've done a lot of translation work. And when I first started doing it, and this might have been also a function of being young and a bit arrogant, I would criticize other people's translations. Oh, that's not very good at all. This is a better way to do it. And then the more time that I actually put in and realized just how difficult it is to even languages that are close to each other, like English and German or English and French, to get the sense of something across in a way that is faithful, but actually makes sense within English.
And within contemporary English as well.
Yeah.
You end up I personally translated a phrase from Nietzsche recently for a piece at Stranger Worlds. And the reason I did it was I could tell from everything that I'd looked at that there was what I wanted it to say was within reach of the source material, but it used this word in German that meant celestial body, and that was usually, I can't remember, I'd read a couple of translations. I thought that's not quite going to work for someone reading this as an epigram, right?
Yeah.
So I tortured myself for a while on that, and I eventually got a translation that I felt was fair to the original source material, but also would work as an epigram, which was quite strangely rewarding for someone who is at best a dabbler in other languages.
Well, so this will lead into the book. It's interesting that you use that phrase, strangely rewarding, that positive affect. That's something that I found in translating there's a sense of accomplishment, but it's not your accomplishment so much. It's rather taking somebody else whose work you think is worth communicating and finding the way to bring them in so
Yeah.
that somebody else can appreciate them. And there's a joy or excitement or whatever it is about that. So your book, The Virtuous Cyborg, you're doing a lot of translating, so to speak, in sort of analogical sense in it. You're also doing a lot of putting ideas together in unaccustomed ways that are supposed to shed light for contemporary people on things that we need, on things that are going on within our society. And you're doing so in a way that leaves a lot of openings. It's not like the handbook on the 21st century or something like that.
How could I
There's
take myself seriously as a philosopher if I was going to talk that arrogantly about it? Nietzsche got away with that,
yeah,
but that was his brand, and it's surely not mine.
yeah. So let's talk about the origin of the book in the
Sure.
first place. You've got a lot of really fertile ideas that you're bringing in. You're also very good too, I'll say this, at sort of narrating experiences in ways that then connect to and illustrate the key ideas. You begin the book by talking about a video game that you'd played as a kid, and all sorts of other things come up along the way. So what was the original kernel or impetus for it?
Right. So this actually builds on your statement, and thank you for saying such kind things about a book that I think is it's going to continue to struggle to find people to read it for reasons that we might touch upon later. I really love it. I was really proud of it, but it run up against some practical problems which I might discuss separately. The
Sure.
background. So I stumbled upon this publisher, Zero Books, who were really open to publishing stuff that couldn't be published anywhere else. And I thought, fantastic! I've got a ton of things that can't be published anywhere else. And so I signed up with them for a trilogy of philosophy books. At the time, I was so sick of video games. I was absolutely desperate to do anything that wasn't video games, just as a palate cleanser, right?
Okay.
As an academic, you'd take a sabbatical year and you'd go and build yurts or whatever it is that you do. For me, I couldn't stop working, but I wanted to do something else that would get me away from it. So I wanted to do philosophy. I've been reading philosophy for quite a while, and I really wanted to have a go at writing books. And Zero signed me up, and I did this trilogy of books for them, which I like to call, and apologies to Wittgenstein, my imaginative investigations. It's each book looks at the role of imagination in a different sphere of life. So it starts with imaginary games, which looks at imagination in art games, and this was me saying, if I'm going to write in philosophy, I've got to use my platform in games. Otherwise, I've got no hope, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I write about video games, but in a really unusual perspective, and that was really well received, and is probably the most popular of the philosophy books that I have put out, probably because of my platform in games. And then I wrote immediately afterwards. I did these 3 books in 3 years, which is pretty silly. The Mythology of Evolution, which looked at the role of imagination in the sciences, and particularly because this role of imagination and metaphor in the sciences is dealt with quite badly and misunderstood, I think. And so I really wanted to wade in there. And that was really badly timed because that book came out the year after the Darwin bicentennial. And so everyone was sick of reading about evolution. And so it sank without a trace in the bookstores, although Mary Midgley
Okay.
absolutely lovely endorsement for it. But it is my most pirated ebook. And apparently, for some reason, people who pirate books online really loved that book. I think it's the discussion of science fiction in the latest captions. Anyway, finished that with Chaos Ethics, which I thought I knew everything I wanted to say about ethics until I actually wrote Chaos Ethics. And at the end of it, I'm just like, what the hell was that? What did I just do to myself? And I knew after that there was no point in writing another long form philosophy book, because I don't think anybody has read all three of those books, which what's the point writing another long book that no one's going to read? So I thought afterwards I would work on short form philosophy books. I would attempt to put them out in a way that might reach a wider audience, partly by being shorter and partly by being less unspeakably dense, for better description. I don't want to knock those three books. I'm really proud of them, and I think that they deal with quite complex topics in accessible ways. But I also know that people read one chapter of it and it melts them, and they have to take a break and come back to it later. It's philosophy.
That said, there are a lot of references to chaos ethics in the Virtuous Cyborg.
So the first short form book was Wikipedia Knows Nothing, which is my book of epistemology, and I think is easily the most accessible thing that I've done. And it's what I recommend if people are interested in reading me. It's a great place to start, because the ETC Press stuck it out, and it's available as a paper, it's available as a PDF, and it's free. So it's an excellent starting place because the price is right? But then, bizarrely, a poetry publisher in London read Imaginary Games, loved it, and said, "We'd love to do a book with you," which I really should have thought twice about this, because they're a poetry press.
Okay.
I thought that by doing a nice technology ethics book that was on the one hand erudite and interesting, and on the other hand accessible and engaging, that I could have another book like Imaginary Games that might sell. But unfortunately, I think the problem with the book is technology ethics is a forbidden subject at the moment. And most of the people who work in quote unquote technology ethics, actually their job is to say why it's okay to make everything possible and not worry in advance about what we're making. And as a result, I could expect no support whatsoever from the technology ethicists for this book. But also, the people who are interested in technology are almost all, for want of a better phrase, accelerationists who really just want to imagine the amazing future that's to come when the technology perfects itself. And as
or after
many engagement with my work, you probably appreciate. That's not me. I am this weird Babette Babich, who has been a great supporter of my philosophy, suggested that I was simultaneously optimistic and pragmatic, or idealistic and pragmatic. And I think it's a great description of the sort of tension that drives me forward. I have an idealism, but I'm pragmatic about it. I don't see the point in holding to an idealism that there's no path through. Right?
Yeah, no realization of it. Yeah.
So I wrote this book without the realization that most of the people who want to read about technology just want to read how amazing the future is going to be, and don't want to actually, think about what we might want to do or not want to do with our technology. So there's this sort of enormous gap where there should be technology ethics and isn't. And this book lands straight in that black hole. And so, although it's been well liked by the people who've read it, like you, but the people who've read it are few and far between, unfortunately, much to my disappointment, because I didn't hit the sales figure that the Poetry Press, that I told the Poetry Press that we would hit for the book. But who knows? Philosophy is one of those things that sometimes is a slow burner, right? So maybe it'll get there in time.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Nietzsche earlier on. I mean, think of that poor guy, reputedly giving away copies of his books to his cleaning lady, because he's got all these boxes. I mean, now we print on demand, so we don't have that problem anymore.
To be fair, though, he was read and did have a readership during his time. I think his frustration with so many people didn't understand what he was saying and still don't. And I think even Nietzsche scholars like Babich, there's tremendous ambiguity because of the aphoristic style that Nietzsche writes in, right? So,
yeah. I'm teaching a class currently on the genealogy, and that's one of the books that I prefer, because he's not systematic ever, but he's as far away as he ever gets from I'm just going to throw a bunch of aphorisms out and see what you make of them.
It's easily the most organized.
That's a good way to put it. Organized, yeah. Organized as opposed to comprehensive, systematic, anything like that.
Yes, and of course it inspires Foucault and unleashes everything that's come downstream from Foucault as well. Not that I want to blame Foucault for everything that's come downstream, but It's
Well, and Bataille and all sorts of other people. Nietzsche was sort of
yes.
like this little secret sauce or something you would use. I mean, Foucault talks about this in an interview, and I think this is it's actually helpful to read this because a lot of people look at French philosophy and they get caught up in the kind of waves, and then they try to apply it to other contexts, and they don't realize just how rigid the French philosophical establishment was at the time. You had phenomenology, you had existentialism, you had Marxism, you had structuralism, and you had history of philosophy, and pretty much that was it. And these people like
At
Foucault or
least two of
Derrida.
those are part of the same lineage because the
Right.
existentialism is just a straight spin-off from phenomenology with a
Well, there's a predecessor bit to it there, you could say. But in any case, we read something like Anti-Oedipus by Deleuze and Guattari, right? And you're like, yeah, screw the establishment. You're not going to Oedipalize me. Well, that's written for France at a certain time. It's not written for us to like cookie cutter apply it to stuff. But you see people in 2020, still bringing up these lines, or A Thousand Plateaus, pick whatever of those guys' books you want. And
I dabbled with A Thousand Plateaus because there was an abridgment, and I that seemed plenty to me.
oh, interesting.
I like what they do.
You mean there was a version that was like pared down to make
Yeah,
it
yeah. So
more?
there's it's on the shelf over here, but I won't go and look.
Okay.
Make for very poor watching. But there's a book that is basically just a chunk of A Thousand Plateaus
Ah,
that's been taken out of it because the way Thousand Plateaus is organized, you can actually get a fair amount of what it's doing from just reading a
yeah, yeah.
slice of it. And that was plenty for me. I like what they're doing. I don't need it for anything I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm more than happy to talk to any Deleuze and Guattari scholars who are out there, and I'm happy to have arguments in the bar as to whether or not Deleuze was ruined by his partnership with Guattari, which is a
Oh,
have you
what's
come across
so so I have a take on that, and I'm
Yes.
curious about what your take is.
You want my take?
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's a minor miracle whenever two people can work together over the long term in any medium whatsoever, and especially in philosophy. And if it was working for them, I have no reason to question it. And that's how I feel about it. It's seriously none of my business who other people choose to work with, right?
Okay.
Even if I read the early Deleuze and thought it was absolutely spiffing, and I've dabbled a bit in there as well, because as is apparent from what I've said before, I like to I like to cast my net wide, right?
Yeah,
I
yeah.
like to have a broad perspective. But even if I loved the early stuff and didn't love the later stuff, I'd still consider it none of my business who people worked with or work with. That's up to them.
Yeah.
As a heretical Kantian, I do like to, respect everyone as an end in themselves.
Okay. See, I don't have a position on whether they should have worked together, but I very decidedly, and I've been reading, Deleuze and Guattari stuff since I was an undergraduate.
Is
I
that because
really,
did your supervisor inflict it on you?
no, no, no. The
No, no,
place, it's very
you came
funny.
across it.
The place where I went to undergraduate, the two professors who taught philosophy were close to retirement, couldn't care less about anything, thought that this is the 90s. They thought that philosophy, the cutting edge stuff was existentialism, Marxism, analytic philosophy, which they thought was going away,
Oh,
and
if
process
only.
philosophy.
Oh,
So it
process
shows.
like Whitehead style
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah, and
Awesome.
nobody was doing that at that time,
No, not in the 90s.
So they had no clue about what had been happening in European philosophy since like the 1950s. And I'll actually just tell this story very, very briefly. There was a Japanese guy there, and his family was like super rich, and that's why he was at this little podunk college, because his grades weren't good enough to get into the Japanese school, so they come over to American school so they can get a degree. And he kind of screwed off and did his own stuff. And he was in my modern philosophy class, and he wrote a 70-page paper, which drew heavily on Bakhtin, Deleuze, and Guattari, some Foucault stuff, some other stuff as well, some Barth, and he wasn't trusting his English enough to present it. So he's like, "Can you present this for me?" And I was like, "Yeah, I guess so." And he's like, "Well, you need to read these books first. And so he just gave them to me because he had tons of money. So that's how I got my first books of these contemporary continental thinkers. And I kept them and read them and enjoyed them and just went from there. So that I got, I would say, at least 70% of the stuff that I teach or write on didn't come from my formal studies in philosophy. It's either stuff that like a friend introduced me to or we thought was cool, so we read on our own, or I read later on after I graduated because I realized that it was a gap in my studies. And that's just a function of where I went to school, I would say.
You have to hope that any philosopher who is teaching at a university worth their salt does not have as their ambition to inculcate a generation of students into the same reading habits as them.
Well,
you want them to be exposed to some of the texts that spoke to you, but you also want them to go off and find the texts that speak to them, right?
Yeah, you would certainly hope so. But I mean, when I think about, and of course, the sample that we get is very, very small of the vast body, but I would say that's not that common of a motivational structure in my experience, unfortunately.
Well, because we see this in peer review, because although I've fled the flaming ruins of academia, I still, for my sins, do peer review for the International Journal of Play, because when a philosophy paper lands in the International Journal of Play, they're like, I hope Chris can take this, because otherwise we've got no one. But I see a lot of peer review out there that disappoints me because the person reading it thinks that their job is to determine whether or not this paper is true or false or right and wrong. And
right.
Nothing could be further from my goal as a peer reviewer. I only want to answer two questions. Have you put together this paper on your own terms in a way that's is congruent and speaks the thing that you're trying to say? And is it relevant for the conference or publication? Those are the only two questions I want to answer. So I could wildly disagree with the paper, and I frequently do, and I'd still not reject it as long as it met those two criteria. Those are the only two criteria that count as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of problematic stuff because I've been on both sides of the, let's call it, editorial divide, with peer review. It's kind of a mess. I think it's hard to even generalize about it.
I think it's easy to generalize about it, and I think you just did it perfectly. It's a mess. It's a colossal mess, and it's, in my view, and I make this argument in Wikipedia Knows Nothing, it's made a mess by the closed peer review process, which invites peer reviewers to treat the people they're reviewing abusively, because there's a balance of power that can never be redressed. And I feel that if peer review was done openly, and the thing is, if I can see reasons why a peer reviewer might wish to remain anonymous, but you can still do your peer review open, even if you as a peer reviewer wish to be kept anonymous, right? It's about whether or not the reviews can be read. If a peer review was open, there would be more motivation for people to commit honestly to the peer review process. So I've for pretty much all the time I've been a peer reviewer, I append to every peer review, I consider blind peer review to be unethical, and I'm willing to be identified to the author of the paper. And the moment I started doing that, I feel that the quality of my peer reviews improved, because suddenly I was taking on a duty to the person who wrote the paper. There's a duty to the conference or the journal, and it changed.
There's a sort of accountability there that you're deliberately taking on.
The way I felt about it completely. Now, I will be frank. I spend far longer on peer review than I suspect most people who are saddled with a teaching job at a university would be willing or able to put in. But for me, if I'm not going to do that, what was the point in taking control, right?
Yeah. There's a sort of, you could, I mean, if we're going to talk about virtues, you could say that diligence is something that applies there. Now, I want to shift to talking about virtues. And you mentioned that, in the technology ethics arena, this book sort of went below their radar because of what they're looking for.
I would like to think I torpedoed them below the waterline, but they didn't sink because they were too stubborn.
Well, it just could be too big to fail, like
Too big to
like
fail.
American
Yes,
aircraft carriers.
absolutely.
They had an aircraft carrier that they decommissioned, and they pulled out somewhere and they threw everything at it for weeks on end, and eventually, it started moving kind of weirdly, but eventually they had to have crews come in and actually like put munitions in it. They're so unsinkable, which in a certain way is like, I mean, do you actually want these things that can't be possibly sunk? But that's a whole other topic. So, it struck me that, and I think there's a case that to be made. So people who are interested in virtue ethics in a robust way. So there's like a very strong, long-standing tradition of Aristotelian virtue ethics. Perhaps the person who's best known for that at present be Alistair MacIntyre. There's the Stoics, and there's a big neo-Stoic movement. They talk about virtue in interesting ways. And there's other similar concepts. I mean, Kant himself, right, talks the metaphysical elements of virtue.
I'm glad you said that, because it's a common misconception.
Yeah.
Kant has no role for virtue, and it's completely not true.
The same for the utilitarians. I mean, Mill talks about it, and even Bentham talks about it. So I think that there's a case to be made that, okay, we don't live in 1950 anymore, and we inhabit this world that you describe in a lot of different ways is essentially just permeated with technology. We have cyborgs, we have the cybergs, which is another concept I want to get you to talk about in just a bit. And one of the recognitions that I think is driving contemporary virtue ethics is this stuff never went away. It's still relevant, but we have to be able to think it through in radically different circumstances.
Yes.
Even if the accelerationists are right, whether they're optimistic accelerationists and we're going to have a singularity and AI will figure out everything for us, or the ones that everything is going to go to crap and then we'll have to bring things out of the ashes. We're going to need virtues, and it's not enough just to talk about virtue. You see this all the time over here in the States with people who are peddling some sort of thing for K through 12 education. We're going to have a bunch of flashcards, they'll say generosity, kindness on them. And the kids come away with no conception of what these virtues actually mean. And classical virtue ethics, Aristotle can say, this is what generosity actually looks like. Here's the motivations for it. Here's how sometimes being a spendthrift masquerades as that. You really need that. And so you identify a number of different, you call them cyber virtues, which, why not, right? Because they're virtues that apply to people whose lives are caught up inevitably with technology, right?
For the benefit of the people watching who've not read the book, which is going to be all of them, the concept of this cyber virtue concept is to point out that when we are forming a cyborg with technology, when a collective that includes a human and machines, there are qualities of that human machine collective, the cyborg, that may or may not be virtuous, and it's completely separate from the sort of character-based, the Aristotelian, if you like, sense of character, which are qualities of the human in isolation. And the whole point of the book is to attempt to provide another way of thinking to a relationship of technology through the perspective of virtue ethics. You mentioned MacIntyre. When I read After Virtue, I don't know where I got that copy from. I think it was in McKay's, which is an excellent Tennessee secondhand bookstore. And I read it and I enjoyed it. And I read it as somebody coming from outside the strictly Catholic tradition that the MacIntyre writes from.
Not at that time. He wasn't, though.
When he wrote After Virtue, he would not converted to Catholicism.
No, that happens later on.
Inevitably, he was going to end up Catholicism. I mean, yes. But I read it as an outsider, and I had no idea how much that book was going to influence me in retrospect. It was. I went back and I read it, and I read several other of MacIntyre's, and I especially love Three Rival Versions of Moral.
Oh, yeah.
I think is an absolute brilliant book and has been an enormous influence. I still draw against it all the time. But I had no idea that MacIntyre was going to influence me that much. Because my view going in, the view on ethics that I put forward in Chaos Ethics is that looking at moral systems as rivals, let's find the right one is a hopelessly pointless activity. But
Yeah.
it's useful to be able to look at ethical situations and moral situations from the different available perspectives. And I argue in Chaos Ethics that there's a moral sentence in any situation, and there's a person acting, and there's actions being taken, and there's some outcome that results. And those are the only three, grammatically, the only three perspectives available. And they correspond to the different schools of ethical thought. And I think the mistake is to think you have to make them duke out with each other.
Yeah.
It was a TV chef contest to determine which wins.
Which one goes on to the next stage? Yeah.
We need all three. We need to be able to use all three. And we absolutely suck at anything based on principle. So all of the duty ethics stuff has gone out the window. All the deontological stuff has gone out the window. And we can't even think about virtue anymore. The only way people are even willing to mention virtue now is in virtue signaling, which is inherently negative, and makes it sound like you can't have virtues or shouldn't have them. And what a disaster. What a colossal disaster.
Yeah.
Firstly, reducing everything to outcomes is a disaster. And then assessing outcomes solely mathematically is an absolute unbelievable mistake. I mean, just a category error of Herculean disastrous proportions.
So I'm going to come back to something that you said. We could think of like Aristotelian virtue ethics, and you can have it in sort of like old-fashioned Aristotle terms, and then you can have people who are adapting it in interesting ways, and I think McIntyre is one of those. Now you set it up as like that's sort of incompatible with the conception of virtue that you're putting forward in this book, but it doesn't seem to me to be that.
No, it is. No, I don't mean to suggest any incompatibility. My point was this concept of cybervirtue isn't an alternative version of virtue.
Okay.
It's, if you like, an application of virtue ethics to a very specific problem space.
Okay, so I'm very happy to hear that, because going back to the issue of, well, who should be reading this book? I mean, ideally, everybody should be reading it, but that's not going to happen.
So. They won't, but thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think a really strong case can be made to anybody who is interested in virtue ethics that this is precisely the sort of line of inquiry that should be carried out. We can talk about all sorts of examples that don't inherently or obviously involve what you're calling a cyborg, a human brought together with some sort of piece of technology or machine. But usually when we look at them, they all do. I mean, so here's a great example. In my classes on tomorrow's class sessions, we're going to talk about various Aristotelian virtues. So we're going to talk about one that typically gets translated as liberality, which the students don't relate to at all. They have no idea what the hell that means. And I just say, well, it's just generosity. It's how you eleutheria, which literally means being a free person. So that's where the liberality part comes in. But it's how you dispense wealth or time or other things that you could possibly be giving somebody. And we're going to talk about, what do you give to somebody who's on the street and asking you for a handout? Do you actually give them something? Do you buy them a meal instead? Do you say, get a job? Do you reach in and take everything out of your wallet and give it to them? Right. And we can say, well, none of that is mediated by technology. Well, I mean, you've pointed out that one of the biggest cybergs is money.
Yes.
Right.
Absolutely.
So money is a technology.
For the benefit of your viewers, in the book, I want to extend this idea of cybervirtue to its obvious extent. And so I suggest that, like an iceberg, where 90% of the iceberg is under the water, we're surrounded by these cybergs, these networks of connectivity, where a whole bunch of tools and a whole bunch of humans are networked together. And you can identify all sorts of large cases of this. The social media networks with billions of humans attached. Right. An obvious example, but so is money, which is by far the most embedded of these cyborg networks. and the oldest as well, since it goes right back to civilization. The cities and coins go together for obvious historical reasons. And so these huge networks, these cybergs that connect lots of humans together with a shared set of tools, have all sorts of effects that are really not inside anyone's control. And I think
Yeah.
I struggle to see economics as a science. I don't mean to diss it, but I tend to see it as the hermeneutics of money, and I value hermeneutics quite highly. So that's probably the nicest thing I could say about economics. But this is it. These tools and these networks associated with them, they behave in certain ways. And some of that comes from the design of the systems. The design of monetary systems have consequences. And any economist will bore you to hell about that if you give them half a chance, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about it in those terms, right? And we don't think about money as a technology. We might think about cyber finance, but we don't think about even just basic coins as a technology. But it's been an enormous transformative technology, and it's very hard to escape from. I mean, I've often wondered what it would be like. I don't think I'll ever do this, but I've often wondered what it would be like to take a year and only engage in barter or arms, charitable, to refuse to engage in the transfer of coin for a year and to try and get back. I think I'm too old and I have 3 kids, so I think it's impossible I could do this. But I do feel like if I'd thought of this when I was much younger and single, that it would be an awesome experiment to see how well I could live for a year without engaging with money at all, because it permeates everything. And I think has distorted the role of the university that we touched on before.
So there are a number of virtues that you identify and explore, analyze within the different chapters of the book. You don't intend this to be a totally comprehensive list?
No, worse than that. Right? I mean, my feeling is if this concept is useful, then it's up to anybody who wants to apply it to find the way of describing it. I would hate anyone to think that this was prescriptive. The good news is, since it's in virtue ethics, nobody will ever use it, let alone use it prescriptively. So I'm kind of safe from being turned into, for want of a better analogy, the Kantian sausage machine. I think nothing has been quite as tragic as Kant's first formulation of the categorical imperative has been interpreted, as Alan would memorably put it, as a sausage machine to crank out rules for ethical living, which just, for me, completely misunderstands Kant's purposes. And I think you can't not dread that you might actually become popular in philosophy and then mechanically, right?
Yeah.
This is something that Deleuze-Guattari don't have to worry about because they get so marvelously abstract. There's just no real danger of being used systematically, right?
Yeah, you have all those people out there who are, talking on and on about the body without organs, and you're like, well, what actually is that? I mean, it varies from passage to passage, and then it's something that works out in memes quite well, I would say, but as soon as you start trying to apply it, there's to steal that phrase, right? There's 1,000 different interpretations of it. Now,
so yes, the specific the things that I choose to pick out, the different things, like cyber tenacity, and,
fidelity,
cyber restraint, cyber kindness. They're simply an entry point for thinking about a particular design issue. Because I mean, this book is a collision between my job as a game designer, where I make money, and my sort of profession as a game designer, and my vocation as a philosopher. And I design systems for play, and I know full well how much the design of those systems affects people's behavior. And yet there's no discussion whatsoever about the way that the design of those systems affects people behavior, unless it's a discussion about how to squeeze more money out of people.
Right. or something coming from outside saying, look at those people playing Candy Crush, mindless entertainment, blah, 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 right? They're hooked, that sort of thing. So it's more a puritanical approach.
Yes, I mean, I'm not going to say that there isn't criticism that can be put into the space. I'm astonished I haven't torpedoed my own career as a game designer by being outspoken about some of these issues, actually. But again, the joy of writing it in philosophy is nobody reads it, and certainly not in game design, so I can totally get away with it. But yeah, there's no thought about these. There's actually very few tools for thinking about the behavioral impacts of things, and most of what does go on happens through mechanics and metrics, which is to say statistical forecasting. And so, for instance, there's a whole sphere of game design, I don't touch it these days, where you're mostly interested in just retaining players and keeping them long enough to take money out and then let them go on the other side. And it can be horribly blind to the experience of the player, because the player is just a raw material being eaten up at the front end. Now, I want to be fair to the space, and I hope that the book is fair as well. There are many people working in that sort of space of games who do think very carefully about what they're doing and are mindful of the risk of things becoming abusive. But in general, the capacity to have a discussion about the effects of design systems, human behavior, and the effects of living in that circumstance. That was what I hoped that I might be able to, I don't know, start people thinking differently about with this book. But I think, to be honest, this cyber virtue concept is actually quite difficult to wrap your head around. And I think it's easy to describe it, but then when you start applying it, when you start thinking about it in specific cases, it becomes much more difficult. And this is, you mentioned more about the use of specific stories. I try wherever possible to use real life examples to go with these things in order to illustrate the point. But at best, all I'm doing is providing examples to enable us to spot that there is this capacity to affect our behavior through the design of the human technology and systems.
So what do you think are the difficulties then in being able to apply these concepts? What makes it tricky?
Well, I think what makes it tricky is that well, actually, before I answer that question, why do you think that you have difficulty getting a younger generation to wrap their head around Aristotelian virtue ethics?
Okay, well, I mean, the first thing is that they're outside of my class probably not encountering it. The one exception will be, and I have one of these in my class, the kid who comes in and thinks he knows it all because his conservative parents homeschooled him in that sort of thing. And then, of course, got it completely wrong, you know? So there's the like, what even is this sort of thing part. And then I would say there's, you know, and this is something that you bring out quite well in your book, and you also just talked about in terms of like the way environments are designed. There's, you could say on a second level, almost like a hidden set of messages that are just enfolded into how we approach things. What is worth talking about, what is not worth talking about. So having them in class and saying, today for an hour and 15 minutes, we're going to talk about, you know, these particular matters, that's something that's just not been done with them much.
So
and
these 2 points already set up the reason why it would be even more difficult to take virtue and then apply it as an order of abstraction that is kind of removed from our everyday experience, right? If we all could speak virtue ethics fluently with each other, it would be easier to make the abstract leap to be thinking about the technology ethics layer. But we struggle even to engage with the virtue side of it. And part of that is, I fear that despite optimistic contributions by Charles Taylor as to the ethics of authenticity, as this accepting of an enormous diversity of ways of being, some of which are authentic, we now don't even really have a coherent sense of how to gauge the authenticity of a position. And so we're just chicken about confronting people about their behavior. And this has kind of blown up on the launch pad
Yeah, that's an interesting point. A lot of our students, there's big worries, and this is mostly American professors who do this, that when students come into an intro or an ethics class, they're all relativists, and they're not. I mean, when it comes down to it in their day-to-day life, they do actually have pretty strong opinions about how money should be spent, or, what counts as cheating on your boyfriend or girlfriend or things like that, and whether it's okay. And they'll argue about that. But they've been told quite often that they don't want to be judgy. They don't want to be judgmental. And so one of the first things that I tell them is, hey, I want you to be judgmental. Just, you have to have some good reasons for the judgments that you're giving. And for a lot of them, it's quite liberating to hear that, because everybody else has been telling them, no, you don't want to, cast aspersions on people or anything like that. And a lot of the time, yeah, our judgments could be completely wrong, and they could be based in just, stereotypes and bias. And we do want to avoid that sort of thing. But being able to say, hey, this is actually wrong, and here's the reasons why it's wrong, and apply it to this particular case, and here's how we could actually make it better or make things more just. They don't get a lot of practice in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Mary Midgley, who is the closest thing to a mentor in philosophy I had, and I mean, she was supportive of a huge number of people and had loads of correspondence. I just happened to be one of them. But
Yeah.
she wrote a book that was written for a mainstream audience called "Can't We Make Moral Judgments?" Which makes this point that despite everyone suggesting, well, not everyone, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
despite this prevailing assumption of relativism everywhere, actually, there's no reason at all that we can't continue to make moral judgments. And making moral judgments doesn't require us to resort to some kind of absolute position. And there's always a position that you're speaking from and to. And I think for me,
Yeah.
when you're engaging with somebody else in these situations, yes, you want to make an effort to understand where they're coming from. But I think you can always engage with people's position if they have one, and if they don't have one, then they have a bigger problem than whatever it is that you're addressing in an individual situation. But I think you're right.
Yeah, they're probably in some sort of muddle then, right?
Yeah, but I think you're right that it is overestimated the influence of relativism, and I think this is another situation whereby an overly simplistic battlefield image of it's a fight between absolutism and relativism, and one of them has to win. It's just like, no, that's complete nonsense. That's complete nonsense.
Yeah.
Because none of these absolute positions actually is thoroughgoing enough or well-rooted enough to survive scrutiny against every circumstance. And the relativists gave up. They waved a little white flag right at the beginning, if there ever was anyone who called themselves a relativist. And it's not even worth arguing at that point, right? Relativism has become a stand-in for a kind of runaway tolerance, except it's not a tolerance at all. I accuse it in Chaos of it of being intolerant tolerance, right?
Yeah.
You're supposed to be accepting of a preset of identities that are permitted. And anyone who doesn't accept that preset catalogue of identities is automatically a bigot, and we can hate them, and we can even murder them and send assassins to kill them, which is not tolerance. It's about as far from tolerance as it could be. It's an insane, self-eating snake tail of a situation. I find it quite bizarre the extent to which that we encounter this kind of attitude today. Compassion, absolutely fantastic, but very, very hard to apply fairly when you're dealing with an enormous diversity of ways of life.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. A lot of people can get hung up on well, you haven't done complete fairness to everybody, so obviously everything that you've done is totally worthless, And, it's you brought up the term pragmatic before. I think I'm very pragmatic when it comes to that sort of stuff. Even if you like
university, so you're kind of forced to be, right?
Well, I mean, some people might say the opposite. Some people might say, given the cushion, that the university provides you of steady employment.
I guess
And
it comes down to how much you're willing to fight the battles inside of it. I have met
right.
academics who are not pragmatic and they simply play a game of smoke and mirrors. Well, on my master's degree, there was a guy whose field was AI, and everyone I spoke to told me the same thing, which is we're not sure if he's a genius or if it's total nonsense. But as a result, no one's in a position to dismiss him from the university, so he's permanently safe. And I just thought the most astonishing thing to encounter in my 20s was that as an academic, you could simply obfuscate the genius in what you were doing so that nobody could tell if it was nonsense or genius, and you could survive in academia.
Well, this is one of my potential rants. I hate the concept of genius, because people throw it around so blithely and have done for over a century. And, once somebody's classified as genius, what you're saying is, well, we ordinary people, however smart we are, can't really understand what they're doing, so we can't judge it. We just have to let them be what they are. And then you could say, well, then how in the hell would you ever know that anybody's a genius? Well, somebody got to call them that, maybe another genius or something like that. So for me, it's
like
you see it.
Club.
There you go. Yeah, almost like in church governance, they had the Presbyterians where it's the elders choosing the next elders, and everybody else has to kind of knuckle under. Just some sort of elite. So I've always distrusted this category of genius. Now, I do want to ask you, there is something I really wanted to ask you, and I'm also curious whether anybody else has asked this as well, and it would have to be relatively near in time. So the book has been out for 6 years. And in that, you're writing about stuff that's kind of a moving target because technology evolves. Some of the cybergs have become bigger. Some have become, I don't know if any have become smaller. But
vicious.
Okay, there you go. So let's say that you were asked to write a second edition of the book today, and they're going to give you like a huge advance. So you're like, hey, this is a very interesting project. It's remunerative. I should definitely do this.
Right. So I, first of all, am not that money motivated and would not pursue a project for fiscal in its own way. I've turned down profitable work in my consultancy work because I wasn't comfortable doing it. I won't specify what it was.
I've done that as well. I've actually fired clients at times in my work.
Be in that a lucky state of life where you have the luxury to about it, right?
Yeah.
But
so here's the question: is there stuff in it that you would change, that you would amplify, that you would modify?
I must be frank. So it was suggested to me by the publisher that we might try and relaunch the book.
Okay.
With a new title and updated. And I declined to do so because this is potentially a highly controversial area that I don't necessarily want to go into at the back end of our discussion today.
Okay.
You're welcome to get me back and we can start from scratch at a later date.
Sure.
But the circumstances that have happened in the last few years have pushed it so that arguing that, as the book does, that we would benefit from this informed capacity to discuss the effects on our behavior of technology has now ceased to be the urgent battlefield. And whilst I still think we need to do this, I think that as the cyborgs have become more vicious. And at this point, de-escalation of the political battlefield is now an absolute requirement before we could possibly get back to the position of this book, which is that we might have discussions about how we would like to live the good life in relation to technology. I think the situation has now got so bad that we've jumped the shark with respect to this. And whilst I still believe that this book has things to say and worth reading, I can't see that I can update it now. Anything that I would attempt to do now would not be an update of this book. It would be something completely different.
Okay. Yeah.
Can you see why I would feel that way?
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, I think you're right that our situation of political discourse And I can certainly say
I'm
here,
sorry, you're saying there is a political discourse. Where is it? I'm curious.
well, it's all over the place, but it's very messy and it's often quite superficial and button pushing. And, I mean, I think you can say that it's there.
If it's
It's just
superficial and
very,
button pushing, is it a discourse? Is it not? Is it not a
yeah, it's a deficient
propagandistic
discourse,
monologues?
you know?
Say again.
It is a discourse. It's just
Okay.
a deficient discourse. It's a
Okay.
crappy one.
Yeah.
People are talking to each other, but you know, they're much of the time, and I think back to like how people pushed buttons with all sorts of things when we were younger as well, and it's not as if it's radically different. The internet certainly has made it, and the 24-hour news cycle has made it much more possible to.
Differences of degree, but not of kind, perhaps.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
Although you can say, I remember when, okay, Republicans and Democrats were partisan and you had your, hard edges on the side, but there was a lot of collaboration and compromise on
It's worth
legislation.
remembering, I was never a fan of Reagan, but Reagan did at the end of each day get together with the Speaker of the House, who was
That's
a
right.
team member. And
Yep.
that for me, it indicates something that we've lost, or at least are struggling to maintain to, certainly in the US context. But the situation's not much better. In fact, I'd suggest that the UK is currently in a worse situation in some regards, in terms of the deficiency of the political discourse, and Germany even worse.
Yeah.
It's all really quite worrying for someone who places a lot of stock in principles. As a Kantian heretic, I place a lot of stock in principles. I think that civilization as a whole requires shared principles, and that we ought to be able to disagree politically within a framework that includes some shared principles. And I'm not finding that right now.
That's quite true. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, to some extent, this is what motivated me to write Stranger Worlds, my substack, my philosophy substack, was this genuine feeling that we were not able to have, we were so far apart, we were no longer able to have even principled disagreements. And so the sort of the purpose of writing it was to focus on principles, but it does it in that weird abstract way that philosophers will go down any rabbit hole exposed to them. I basically each month am picking a different theme and going down a different set of rabbit holes. So it's extremely eclectic, and this is highly ill-advised for somebody writing a newsletter. Newsletters thrive when they have clear focus,
Right.
not when they go off in a million different directions all at once. But if you're intellectually curious, and if you're interested in our principles for life, I encourage getting some engagement with Stranger Worlds. I really enjoy writing it, and each one's only 750 words, which
That's tough to do.
It is tough to do, but I really enjoy it. I think I've done so much writing now, because my game design work is basically writing documents, right? So I'm a million words a week kind of guy. Trying to craft a 750 word piece that captures a particular idea is a philosophical challenge I absolutely love. And astonishing to me, I can still break people in 750 words. That there are people who will start reading one and then they're not able to finish it because it's philosophy, and there's just a million different ways to break people's thoughts, right? But I mean, that's fun. I think it's fun. It's different. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you don't read all of them or any of them. It's there as as an encounter with different thoughts and ideas, if that makes any sense.
That raises something I'd like to get your take on. So certainly within, you could call it a set of groups within the philosophy world at present, there's this big talk about doing public philosophy or public facing philosophy. And, it's interesting too, because there's even like a public philosophy network out there who gets to decide what counts as public philosophy or not. And sometimes the things that those of us who engaged in public philosophy before it really had a name were told, no, you're not doing the right sort of public philosophy. And there's this constant drumbeat of your writings must be relevant to the common person in the street. That's why philosophy isn't being read anymore. You have a mission to do that. But I think you could say that, well, there is something to that. but the exclusivity of that is that's part of the problem. The sort of writing that you're talking about, going down rabbit holes, talking about things that you're exploring in intelligent ways that somebody could get something out of, or they could get broken by it. That's also doing public philosophy.
I hope
And
so, because
yeah, and it seems just as legitimate as the I'm going to explain Kant's, first formulation of the categorical imperative in examples that you can relate to and apply today. That sort of thing. And not to knock it, that's great that people do that, but that's only one kind of reaching the public.
I agree. Yeah. And I think it's been interesting to me because the readership that I do have at Strange Worlds, I don't have a handle on it at all. I'm struggling to understand who it is that I'm pulling in. I'm grateful that I'm being read. But most people are reading, and I have no idea anything about them at all. And I have only the scantest clues as to the position of this audience. It's very, very strange. But also, going back to your earlier thing, your suggestion that you can describe academic philosopher as having arranged into camps, for me, is darkly hilarious, because I think the academic philosophy is completely colonized by analytic philosophy now. And to the extent that even the analytic philosophers insist that they engage in continental philosophy, by which they mean they take a text, translate it into English, and break it down into its arguments, which is not continental philosophy.
Well, and they don't read the whole text anyway. They just read the little portions they're interested in.
They're boiling it down into a set of arguments. The fact that analytic philosophy is so compatible with the large language model's capacity to make meaningless précis out of large texts of words is, to me, an enormous mark against it as a form of sort of humanly valuable philosophy. I don't want to completely knock analytic philosophy. Myself, it's hard not to. But you, by your own confession earlier on, you speak multiple languages. You'll engage with the original text, even if you don't want to call yourself a continental philosopher. You are capable of participating in some of the forms that constitute continental.
Oh yeah, and actually that's where I cut my teeth in graduate school. I was going to write my dissertation on Derrida, and ended up writing on a more obscure person. And
we're facing the complete extinction of continental philosophy now. This is a Babbitt, who I mentioned before. This is a theme she comes up repeatedly, and I think she's absolutely right. There is an inherent hostility, and there's a hiring disadvantage.
That's true.
If you're working in continental philosophy, good luck getting hired anywhere, to the extent that within a generation, we could have eliminated continental philosophy entirely. When the current generation of German and French-speaking continental philosophers die out, I do not believe that they will be replaced with a new generation unless something absolutely incredible happens.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you look at, so Scandinavia has long been very interested in analytic philosophy. And then you look at what's going on in Germany, you could say that the push is analytic philosophy or pragmatism. There's a lot of engagement of
analytic philosophy, or a different flavor of analytical philosophy. It's like the scene in the Blues Brothers where they go into the honky tonk and say,
it kind of depends,
country and West.
Yeah. I mean, James, it depends on like whose pragmatism is driving things. James is much more like what we call continental philosophy or history of philosophy. He reads whole books. He's, reacting to things. He's cobbling ideas together.
In a style that's enormously accessible to analytic thinking. And most of the people who have championed James's writings to me, I looked a little bit at it, but I didn't get much of it. I found it very, very analytic in style. Now, I'm back projecting, undoubtedly, right? Because the term doesn't really come in until mid-20th century.
It's interesting too, because you mentioned like the hiring stuff here in the United States. Part of what did classical American philosophy in was the dominance of analytic philosophy, drawing from stuff that happened in Britain. And not only did the history of philosophy suffer, and what we can call continental philosophy over here, but the classical American philosophy foundered quite a bit as well. I belonged to a pluralistic department when I was in graduate school, and we just gone through like wars where the analytics had tried to kick out all of the continental people, but also all the classical American philosophy people. And the only thing that really turned the tide, other than tenure, was the fact that they started retiring and dying off. So the new hires in the department skewed things towards the sort of combined classical American and continental. And then, of course, they started, fighting with each other and trying to sideline each other.
But honestly, this disaster has very deep roots, right?
Yeah.
By the time we get to the divorce between psychology and philosophy, and which I think the poster child for is Wittgenstein, right? Because Wittgenstein is the only philosopher that psychologists will cite in, or at least they used to. Whether they still do is anyone's guess. But there was a period of time, late 20th century up to the early 21st century, where Wittgenstein could be cited in psychology papers as well as in philosophies. And there's a divorce here, because for Kant, these two are just all part of the same run. And of course, that is the breaking off of natural philosophy and then rebranding it as science, right? I view that as largely going down in the 19th century. And I view it as being pretty disastrous for the sciences, to be quite honest. It's been a fabulous thing for technology and for investments in technology, but it's not been great for the sciences as a process of investigation. I genuinely,
well, that's true. Yeah.
I genuinely think we still tout all of the dogmas about what we're expecting the sciences to do. They don't do it. They don't. None of the scientific fields engage in any honest investigation whatsoever. And the number of papers, I just read one before I came in with you, and I read it and I thought, you knew what you wanted to find when you constructed this research paper, and you're claiming that your results found it. And I'm looking at what you've done, and I don't think it says that at all. Only the fact that you went looking for that made you think you'd found it. It's just stunning. I think we lost a lot in this splitting off of natural theology from philosophy, and the fatal flaw in analytic philosophy, which will take out philosophy departments in every university if something isn't done about it, is that we are no longer recognizing that philosophy is actually central to everyone's lives, and that the kind of academic philosophy, which is the crunchy side of is simply the crunchy side of philosophy. Unless we get back to the point of recognizing that literally everyone engages in philosophy, we're completely screwed. We're completely screwed. And this tendency amongst people who self-identify as analytic philosophers to step off and try and basically say nice things about the sciences in the hope that that will allow them to survive. Honestly, this is just like collaborators in Nazi-occupied Paris. It's just not going to work. It's not going to work. The scientists do not care. The scientists don't care about philosophy of science. They've made that abundantly clear. The last generation of scientists that cared about philosophy was probably not Einstein's generation, but one generation after it, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
After that, the specialization takes over, and philosophy is now, you find scientists coming out denouncing philosophy as worthless. And I'm just thinking, so you're engaging in philosophy and telling me it's worthless? This is not a great argument to be mounting. What on earth? Yeah, I really worry about what will happen to the philosophy department if we do not actually break this domination for analytic philosophy. I think it may require ditching the continental analytic divide and finding some new framework that allows us to get out of this universal analytic bias. It's going to be very
I mean, that's something that I've been asked to give talks about it at different points, the analytic continental divide. And I usually point out it's a very parochial and time-bound sort of thing that predominates, right? Because there's all there isn't just analytic and continental, there's all these other things going on. And then there's, as we started out talking about at the very beginning, vast cultural spheres that have their own philosophical traditions that are millennia old and still in development and often in communication with and assimilating things from Western philosophy that are worth studying. But let me ask you this: as you've been very generous with your time, and I want to bring this to a close. So let's say that the worst happened, and these concerns went completely unheeded, and somehow every university lost its philosophy departments. And we'll go even further with this imaginative thing. Bookstores stop having a philosophy section in the bookstore. Amazon stops doing that.
That there are still bookstores, at least.
Okay, yeah, there you go. So and libraries, even libraries are like, yeah, we don't classify things as philosophy anymore. I mean, now we're getting very far-fetched, but so. Well, sure. I mean, libraries are pretty conservative. They've got the Dewey Decimal System and they've got the Library of Congress, and I don't think they're ever going to abandon one or two of those. And, the Library of Congress one, it's all the B's, and there's some other stuff as well. And in Dewey Decimal, the whole 100s, except for that weird, like, pseudoscience, witchcraft kind of numerology section.
You can't imagine in 100 years' time that there's a new generation of people who go into libraries who say this terrible Dewey Decimal System is a colonial artifact and must be
destroyed. I suppose so. Yeah.
Replace it with this entirely new equitable system.
Okay. So let's
even in the libraries lies not so far from the course.
So let's assume that happens, and you can't go to a university and study philosophy anymore, and you can still find philosophy books, but there's no easy way of aggregating or associating them. I mean, it would only be up to a very few people who were lucky enough to run across classical philosophy works to keep on thinking about it and talking about it? Or would it be that bad where it would almost be like, I don't know, there'd be some sort of cultural catastrophe, I suppose you could say.
I think what you are describing is a cultural catastrophe that you're looking at specifically from the perspective of philosophy. But I think the cultural catastrophe you're talking about is a wider cultural catastrophe, and it's the total collapse of free speech. And I think this is a political battlefield that is going on at the moment that's enormously relevant to the politics of the US, the UK, Germany that we mentioned before. And I suspect to many other places that I just don't have interlocutors who can give me a sort of a reading on the ground to how it is. If free speech goes, if it becomes no longer acceptable to think and speak freely, philosophy goes along with dozens of other aspects of human life. And I believe there is enough of us who can see how catastrophic that would be that we will probably avoid the catastrophe. But it doesn't mean that we won't have to have quite a challenging interval where we are having to make a case for principled free speech that means that, yes, some of the things that you're going to see and hear are going to be things you don't like. Right? Some of them could be enormously offensive. But if we don't defend a principled version of free speech, we are not defending free speech. And I worry when this term free speech absolutist has been coined, because it makes it sound like a kooky, crazy position to hold what has actually been the cornerstone of civilization for at least since the founding of the United States of America. And one of the reasons that made it easier to make this, I mentioned before we started, an idiot who's made 5 international moves, but coming back to the US at this time, I was grateful for the existence of the First Amendment and for a lively legal scholarly tradition that defends the meaning of this freedom of thought and belief and speech, because there's nothing like it in the UK. And it's one of the reasons why I think that the free speech position in the UK is worse than it is in the US at the moment. And the situation in Germany is worse still. But
it's interesting too, because Oh, go
I
ahead.
genuinely believe in the American citizens in a way that I do not believe in the American political parties. And I am hopeful that we can actually stem the tide of this before the kind of catastrophic future that we're talking about comes about.
Mm,
There's a lot of people who fear for a sort of theologically constricted future. The Handmaid's Tale is practically a Bible in paranoia for some people, right? I
yeah.
I can understand why you would worry about that. I don't see that as the thing to worry about. The lovely thing about American religion is it's enormously diverse. It's far more diverse than people give it credit.
Right,
If
right.
attempts to enforce one version of it will not work, and it will blow up every time. And I hope that that actually serves as some kind of bulwark and defense that will keep the First Amendment being pushed at grassroots, if that makes any sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because you see how pervasive American discourse about these matters is, because there are people in Great Britain or in Canada or Australia, other parts of, let's call it the Anglosphere, who will appeal to the First Amendment.
Yes.
And then you're like, well, you don't have that over there. You know?
Absolutely.
And you're like, how did you think that this would be a useful appeal? But it does seem to have some sort of cultural currency that now
We
has.
may have given up the idea of natural rights, but
Mhm.
nonetheless, there is something powerful about formulations of freedom, principles that defend freedom, that speak beyond the legal framework that they come with, such that the First Amendment may only legally apply in the United States, but
Right,
everyone
right.
everywhere likes to believe that the same kind of protection applies to them, even though legally it does not. And that actually suggests to me that
Well,
even,
that's a moral claim, right?
yeah,
Then,
absolutely.
yeah,
Well, but there's this entanglement between morality and law, which is a dangerous thing. It's a dangerous
yeah.
thing, but it also is unavoidable and I think important. And I think as long as people do recognize the necessity of what the First Amendment stands for, even outside of where it legally applies, there's hope everywhere, right? We will not go down without some strong words.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, on that alternately pessimistic and optimistic sort of point of view,
I hope it's optimistic. The fact that
yeah,
I see disaster, a potential disaster around the corner, doesn't change the fact that I believe that we can prevent that disaster happening, and I hope and trust that we will.
yeah. Well, thanks very much for this wonderful
I had a
conversation,
blast, Frank.
and also for the book. I actually really enjoy it. I've talked about it with other people. I don't know if they've bought any copies yet, but I'll keep
It
doing
seems
that.
unlikely.
And
I'm glad that you're one of the half a dozen people who read this book.
maybe half a dozen who really, really enjoyed it. I'm sure it's had quite a few readers.
I got a lot from writing it, so that even if nobody read it, I would not consider the time writing it not worthwhile. I just feel sad for my poetry press that I didn't
Yeah,
get the sales figures that I suggested to him that we might with it. But
I have a book like that actually. And it's on.
show me an academic philosopher who doesn't have a book like that.
Yeah, but it was intended to be like a research tool that would help, people delve into these debates that took place. So I did a lot of translations and wrote like 100-page historical and thematic introduction. And the one thing that screwed it over was the price point. I had lots and lots of people tell me that, yeah, if it had been priced at $50, I would have bought it, but it's $75, so I'm not gonna get it.
Yeah, the
And
academic publishers
what
have
are you
this
gonna do?
nasty racket going whereby they can charge. I've got a book on the shelf here that was given to me in a free speech event in London, and they get the two of the people they gave me this book. It's this big, and it's like $200, and it's
Oh, is
$200.
it from a Dutch press?
It's there because certain
Yeah, yeah,
libraries with large endowments will buy every book that comes out, and that will pay for printing the book. But it
yeah.
also excludes any possibility that anybody outside an academic context ever sees a book like that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
it's
even
very
even in academia, I mean, the bulk of colleges and universities are not these well-endowed
No.
juggernauts that
Yeah.
can purchase everything. They don't even have full JSTOR, you know? So, but thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for
And
inviting me, Greg. As you can probably tell, I love having a lively conversation. I've had a brilliant
yeah,
conversation with you. It's been a ton of fun.